Hi, I'm Marilyn Widener, President and owner of Fiberglass Developments. The video you are about to see is a demonstration of fiberglass molding. Molding is probably the most common technique used in fiberglass work and enables the ordinary person to make a single part or several parts, all identical and all perfect replicas of the original.
Hi, I'm Dennis Michael, Sales Manager at Fiberglass Developments. The molding techniques which you are about to see apply to large and complex objects, as well as small objects. For this video, we have selected a model aircraft cowling. I will show you the complete process of molding as a series of steps from building the plug, constructing the mold, and then pulling the finished part. A complete project would take a week or so to complete. In order to make this video, we have prepared several steps in advance. Please take note of the times when you must wait to proceed between the steps. Most people either want to rush through or they want to set the project aside and come back in several days. Both of these adjustments to time can ruin a project. We will explain timing concerns throughout the video.
You will also want to keep safety in mind as you watch this video. At all times, you want to protect your eyes and skin from resins and fiberglass. You also want to work in a well-ventilated area and avoid all sources of ignition. Finally, if any of the terms or materials in this video are unfamiliar to you, you might wish to review our video, The Basics of Fiberglass, or our catalog, which also describes the materials in more detail. As always, Dennis and all fiberglass salespeople are happy to answer your questions and help you through your project. The first step of molding is developing the plug. The plug is the form which is to be duplicated. Model aircraft kits typically supply a cowl which is not as strong as many modelers would like. The supplied cowl is typically in two pieces and is designed to be glued together, have the holes cut out, sand the edges, and the cowl would be ready for installation into the model plane. In our case, however, we are going to use this cowl as the plug and use it to build our mold. The cowl was simply glued together and trimmed to create the form we want to duplicate. If you do not have such a convenient way of creating the form, you will want to sculpt it in foam or some other way of creating the exact size and shape you want. In order for the form to become a suitable plug, it needs to have a prepared surface. A smooth, finely finished plug is very important. Take time to make a perfect plug, as it affects every step throughout the process. This cowling was filled with ordinary automotive-type putty filler and then sanded until it was perfectly smooth and no pinholes or imperfections were found. It was then primered with ordinary spray primer and sanded with ultrafine sandpaper to have a perfectly smooth finish. Ordinary automotive-type fillers and primers are generally used when constructing the plug rather than special fiberglass materials. The second step of molding is constructing the parting board and resting the plug at the center line. The purpose of this step is to mount the plug in such a way as to expose it at exactly the center line, dividing the plug exactly in half. First, the box is constructed. 3 boards are nailed together to build the base of the box. The box must be taller than half of the plug, as you will see when the parting board is mounted. To make the parting board, Dennis traces the outline of the cowl on a piece of masonite. He then cuts out the shape. A good cut makes it easier to mount the plug, but slightly too large is better than slightly too small because it is possible to fill in the gaps between the plug and the board with clay. Next, Dennis waxes the plug and the board 4 times. He uses the number 11 mold release wax, which is a Carnauba wax specially designed for mold release applications. Each coat is allowed to haze, is buffed off, and then is left alone for 1 hour before applying the next coat. After all 4 coats of wax have been applied, the plug is ready to be mounted in the parting board. Dennis draws the center line on the plug with a magic marker. This way he can visually verify that the plug is resting properly. Additionally, he has built braces for the plug so that it rests at exactly the center line. Now, exactly half of the plug is exposed, which is necessary for construction of the mold. Next, the gaps around the plug need to be filled in. Dennis uses the number 104 clean clay, a non-drying, oil-based clay which allows for future application of wax and PVA. Compatibility of all molding clays and mold release agents is very important.
Now once I get the clay all pushed down into the gap, I take the stick and I push firmly down and flush to the parting board and wipe up all the excess. As you can see, it comes off and makes a nice clean corner from the parting board to the plug, which is actually going to be our mold edge. And now the mold, or the plug, is completely clayed, and the crack and the gap are completely sealed with a nice clean corner, and the mold is ready to be waxed again.
The entire surface is then waxed a final time, including the clay and the board. It is necessary to wax over the clay before applying the PVA. Be careful not to change the position of the plug in the parting board. Because this is the last coat, it is not necessary to wait an hour after buffing the wax to continue. You must only wait until it hazes, buff it off, and then proceed. Dennis is ready to apply the number 13 PVA. PVA and wax systems are designed to be used together and are not interchangeable with other systems. The PVA is best applied by spraying. Dennis uses a pre-vol sprayer, which allows a fine mist to be sprayed. PVA is applied as 3 light mist layers, allowing about 10 minutes between coats to dry. Excess PVA can cause problems in the surface coat, so it is important to apply the PVA as a light mist. After the 3rd layer of PVA has dried, it is necessary to wait 2 to 3 hours before proceeding. After this time, the process of constructing the mold can begin. Do not proceed if the PVA has not dried. The 3rd step of molding is to lay up the mold. The first layer to apply is the surface coat. Since this will be an epoxy mold, an epoxy surface coat is selected. Dennis uses the number 458 Akimi epoxy surface coat. Some people prefer a white surface coat to see air bubbles and pinholes, but Dennis likes dark colors better, so he mixes some black pigment in. The surface coat is now ready to apply. This layer will create the surface of the mold from which future parts will be pulled.
This material is quite thick and it leaves brush marks in the coat, but as it flows out, the brush marks go away. Now what I want to do is pack some of the surface coat into the corner here. Put that on kind of thick right there, all the way around it. This is going to be the corner of the mold, actually the edge of the mold. After I have the corner completely filled in, now I'm going to use the 1-inch brush, which we have here, to make the lip. This is actually going to become the lip of the mold. And I'm just going to neatly go around the whole mold. I tend to go over just a little bit over 1 inch because when we trim this section, it won't be real critical. Going past the back just a little bit. Again, this will be trimmed off later in the process. Make sure I have no empty spots or uncovered areas. You can see the brush strokes melting in and flowing out quite well.
Epoxy surface coats and polyester gel coats require special attention to time as well as thickness. You can proceed to the next coat too soon, or you can wait too long. There are a variety of methods to test the surface coat to determine if it's ready, but the easiest method is a simple brush test. You want to proceed when the brush still leaves a mild impression, but does not disturb the surface coat. This takes from 45 minutes to over an hour, depending on the size of the batch that you mix. After the surface coat passes the brush test, a second layer of surface coat is applied. You will need to mix a fresh batch, as any remaining from the first batch will also have begun to cure. After the second layer of surface coat also passes the brush test, you will be ready to begin laying up with fiberglass. First, Dennis mixes a small batch of the number 88 epoxy resin, number 87 cure, and number 22 glass microspheres to make a paste. He measures and mixes the resin and cure very carefully to be sure he has the right amount of cure for the amount of resin. Since this is a 5-to-1 system, he measures 1 ounce of resin and 0.2 ounce of cure and stirs them together carefully. The number 22 is then added to the desired consistency. He is making a putty which he will use to back the tight corners and edges of the cowling where fabric might pull away.
I take the spatula and just scrape it just like that to get a nice little even fillet. Pulling a little bit off and back into the cup. Now I want to add a little bit of paste here to this indention here, which will help build up and back up this indention here when the glass will have something to lay on. And also this little curve here, which we want to build a little paste fillet.
Next, Dennis will mix a base coat of resin to apply behind the paste. This time he mixes a 2-ounce batch of resin with 0.4 ounce of cure. This resin system begins to cure in about 20 minutes, so he wants to only mix a batch size that he can use in less than 20 minutes. He applies the base coat of the resin to the surface coat, careful not to disturb the putty. After the base resin coat, he is ready to begin laying in his layers of reinforcement. Dennis has pre-cut the layers of reinforcement he will need. This avoids the need to count layers as they are applied and saves cutting time after the resin is mixed. For this mold, Dennis will use 4 layers of 2-ounce fabric and 8 layers of 6-ounce. Remember that the mold should be at least 3 times thicker than the parts which are to be pulled from it. He begins by laying up the first layer of 2-ounce fabric. This delicate fabric is excellent for wetting into small areas and allowing a uniform surface for subsequent layers. Larger molds would not require such a delicate material. The fabric begins to wet itself out from the base coat of resin. Dennis brushes additional resin on as needed. He also brushes the resin onto the fabric which lies around the mold on the board. This will form the lip of the mold.
And I wet this out here. Now that first layer of 2 ounces on the plug, it'll hold that putty in position and the putty won't move at all. And see little air bubbles that you might want to just dab out with your brush and help saturate that in. Working any of your wrinkles out with your brush, your finger, gently pushing on the paste because the paste is still quite soft, so you want to use a little bit of finesse there when you're pushing against the paste and try not to disturb it or distort it anyway. Got a little bubble here. I'll take my scissors and I can just cut a little bit of a slit in there. Help let that lay down a little bit. After multiple layers, this will end up being pushed right into place. Okay, that's still pretty wet, so what I'll do is I'll ready for my next layer, which will be exactly the same as this one, and I'll lay it on the same basic way.
He will lay up all 4 layers of 2-ounce material before proceeding to the 6-ounce. About 20 minutes have passed since Dennis mixed his batch of resin, so it is necessary to mix a fresh batch to continue. He proceeds by repeating the same layup steps with the 6-ounce fabric. He lays in each layer, one at a time, until all 8 are in place.
Now we are adding the first layer of 6-ounce material, which is quite a bit heavier, but it'll go on exactly the same as the 2-ounce. Laying it on the top, folding it down. This material is more rigid, but it helps build much quicker now. We have our initial layers on our mold. It takes quite a bit more resin now to wet out as the fabric absorbs the resin at a faster rate, meaning that there's more fabric to absorb. Got the final coat of fabric on, and I'm just blotting it out, making sure that it's completely saturated and wetted out all the way around the perimeter, and there's no dry spots anywhere on the mold. Pushing in any of the air bubbles, trying to saturate that out.
There are now a total of 12 layers of fiberglass on the mold. The mold half is now completed and will be left alone for about 30 minutes until it is partially cured, but still soft enough to be trimmed with a knife. Dennis trims the mold, leaving about a 1-inch lip, which will later be used to join the mold halves together.
So I'm going to take and start here. I can see the outline of the surface coat through the cloth layers, and I'm just going to follow that outline and pushing hard, and I'm cutting actually into the box.
After trimming, the mold half is left to cure for 24 hours before removing it from the parting board. To remove the mold from the parting board, Dennis uses a number 784 mold release wedge. He works the wedge around the edges of the mold, gently prying it up from the board until it is released. After the mold half has been released, it is washed. The clay and PVA are washed off with warm water. Sometimes household dishwashing liquid is helpful, but solvents are not recommended. After the mold half is washed, the surface is inspected to make sure no residual clay or unexpected imperfections are found.
Now that I have the mold washed off and the PVA is removed and the clay excess is removed, the next step is to trim this outside edge. As you can see, the surface coat is only out about 1 inch, but when I trimmed it with the knife, I came out just a little bit extra so I wouldn't come too close to the plug. I'll take a Dremel tool and just trim back nice and neat right up to that surface coat layer. And I'll also trim back the back edge of the cowling also.
Next, the hole in the parting board is cut to allow the mold to be turned over so that the other side can be constructed. The plug is then waxed, as well as the lip of the mold half. Although the plug has already been waxed 3 times, the lip still requires all 3 coats of wax with an hour wait between coats. When the waxing process is complete, 3 layers of PVA are again applied, waiting 2 to 3 hours after the final coat before proceeding with the layup. After the PVA has dried, the other mold half is ready to be constructed. The process will be exactly the same. First applying 2 layers of surface coat and allowing each to dry before continuing, an epoxy putty applied to the corners and edges, applying a resin base coat, laying up 4 layers of the lightweight 2-ounce cloth and 8 layers of 6-ounce cloth. Again, the lip will be trimmed in about 30 minutes, just as soon as it is firm enough to be trimmed, but still soft enough to be done with a knife. It is then allowed to cure for 72 hours before continuing. After 72 hours, Dennis drills a series of holes through the lips. These holes are for both alignment and clamping. They will be used later to clamp the halves together when the mold is being used to lay up parts. The 4th step of molding is to release the mold from the plug. Mold release can be very difficult under the best of circumstances. After someone finds a mold release system which works well for them, they usually refuse to even try other systems. As you can imagine, if the mold sticks to the plug, the mold surface would need to be repaired. There are a number of techniques used to release a mold. Large molds are even hit with rubber sledgehammers. Plastic release wedges are available in various sizes depending on the size of the mold. Large and medium molds usually require several wedges, but a small mold such as this requires only a single small wedge.
Okay, now I'm going to attempt to release the mold from the plug, and I've got my wedge that I'll work into the crack or the half of the mold, and I can gently see that I've got it started, and I just push with the wedge. As I work it in, you can hear that it starts to release as I slide it around, and we got one half of the mold came loose, and now the other half is simply just squeezing in a little bit on the plug just to release it from the edge. As you can see, it's not sticking really too much. You want to be careful you don't damage the mold, so you want to be as gentle as you can without damaging it. And
After the mold is released, it is again washed to remove all clay and PVA. It is dried and the surface is inspected for areas which might require repair. If such repairs are necessary, great care must be taken to not alter the geometry of the mold, as the mold surface will translate directly to the part. Also, when a mold is released, there is typically a small amount of flash around the edges, which needs to be removed. Dennis uses his Dremel tool to grind off the edge and then sands it smooth. When the mold surface is satisfactory, it must be further prepared to begin making parts. First, it is sanded and polished. You want the surface as shiny, as smooth, and as perfect as possible. Dennis uses the number 114 boat polish, which contains a mild abrasive. He also sands with both a 400 grit and a superfine sandpaper until the surface is perfectly smooth. This can take a bit of time because you want the mold surface absolutely perfect. Again, the mold is washed and completely dried before proceeding to fabricating the part. The fifth step of molding is to prepare the mold for fabrication of the part. The surface of the mold is prepared the same way that the plug was prepared for release. At least 3 layers of wax are applied, again buffing the wax when it is hazed and allowing an hour between coats. After the 4th and final layer of wax, 3 coats of PVA are applied, following the same procedure as before. 3 coats of a light mist, allowing 10 minutes between coats to dry, and then allowing 2 to 3 hours for the final coat to dry before beginning the layup of the part. Remember that excess PVA is not advised and can cause problems such as wrinkling if too much is used. Future releases from a seasoned mold do not require so many layers of wax. The 6th step of molding is to lay up the part. You will first want to brush on a surface coat. You could use the Akimi product that we use to build the mold, a gel coat for a polyester part, or as Dennis prefers, a layer of epoxy resin and silica. Dennis adds the silica to the epoxy to thicken it because running or sagging could harm the finished appearance. Silica should not be used, however, to make the resin pastes we used before. Often silica pastes do not cure properly. This surface coat will ultimately be the outside surface of the fiberglass cowling. The purpose of this surface coat is to color the part, add gloss, and usually to prohibit the glass pattern from showing through. If you wanted a red part, for instance, you would add red pigment to this surface or gel coat. In this case, Dennis intends to paint the surface, so he is only concerned that the surface coat provide a smooth surface, free of pinholes, and that it is thick enough to keep the glass pattern from coming through. A single layer of surface coat is applied and allowed to cure for about 20 minutes, just enough to set up and pass the same brush test which was used on the Akimi surface coat.
Now that I have the complete surface of the mold covered with a thin layer of epoxy, I'll need to spend time every few minutes as the epoxy will run down the side and just pull up with a brush with a light stroke to keep the resin up on the walls of the mold.
Because the cowling has some small edges, Dennis mixes a small batch of the number 22 paste. he sparingly fills in small voids. Excess resin is not desirable because resin alone without fiberglass is not particularly strong and can be quite brittle. But filling these small areas in is preferable to possibly leaving a void causing a weak spot. Behind the paste, he lays down a light base coat of resin, careful to avoid the paste. If the resin were to mix with the paste, it would dilute it, which could cause the paste to run or sag. He is now ready to begin laying up the reinforcement layers.
We can take our first layer of 4-ounce cloth and we'll lay that in the mold. Just gently wet it in with my fingers. Careful here, not disturbing the paste, but gently just pushing it down in. Once I get the fabric positioned, I'll take the brush and apply just a little bit of resin to help saturate some of the dry areas. Working the seam together there in the middle where there's a split, making sure all the mold is covered. And anything that we miss on this layer, the second layer will cover. This is where we want to be careful that if we see any air bubbles, we want to try to push them out with our brush, just gently squeezing and blotting with our brush against any air that we see, and it'll work its way out. Making sure that we have plenty of resin all the way up to the edge and a little bit past the edge of the mold, which will help in trimming the mold. Make that top part a little hard. Make sure we brush on the edge real well. Okay, we got that saturated pretty well. Now we can lay in our next layer, which is a layer of 6-ounce. Same way we laid the 4-ounce in. Positioning it. Using our fingers, positioning the seam. Taking a brush and add just a little bit of resin to where the dry areas are to help wet that out. You can see where it's obvious where the areas are dry. Once you blot it out and wet the material out, it tends to disappear into the other layer, and it looks all like one single layer. Okay, now that we have the laminate completely saturated and wetted out, I take an ordinary ball of Kleenex or toilet paper, whichever you prefer, and just blot out some of that excess resin that you see puddling in the bottom of the mold. And this will help absorb some of that excess resin, and there's no need to have excess resin in a part like this because it's only going to add weight.
These 2 layers of reinforcement behind a single layer of surface coat and putty are all that is used to make the cowling halves. Both halves are allowed to partially cure for about 30 minutes, and then they are trimmed flush with the mold.
Now the mold's ready to be trimmed. It is partially cured, soft enough to trim with a knife, similar to how we trimmed the mold. I stick the knife in and just gently come around the edge and trim. Carefully cutting right through. As you can see, the resin is not hard. It's still got a little bit of pliability, but it cuts real well with the knife. Makes a nice, neat trim.
Dennis joins the two halves by using the holes he drilled in his mold. He fastens the mold with number 785 fastening clips. Other means of fastening the mold, such as clamps, are also suitable. He is now ready to seam the halves. First, he has prepared number 88, number 87, and number 22 paste. The paste is used to fill the seam, but is not strong enough to join the halves. Reinforcement is necessary for strength. Therefore, against the wet paste, he laminates in a strip of 1-inch fiberglass tape with the same 88-87 epoxy resin. Tape is used because slitting fiberglass fabric results in fraying, which can pull up when laminating. Because the tape is easy to wet out, Dennis simply dips it in his resin and squeezes out the excess with his fingers.
Now I take the tape and I lay it down in the center and just pushing it in place with my finger. Now I take a brush, just with just a little bit of resin on the end of it, just to wet it a little bit. And now I just saturate or push down and wet out the tape onto the part.
You will remember that this final stage of trimming and seaming is conducted when the part is only about 30 minutes into the cure. At this stage, the part is still soft enough to be trimmed with a knife, and the seam is able to cure into the part while the whole part is still curing. The molding of the fiberglass cowling is now complete. It must be allowed to cure 24 hours before removing it from the mold. The seventh step of molding is releasing the finished part. The same release techniques are used when releasing the part from the mold as when releasing the mold from the plug. Care must be taken when prying to avoid damaging the part as well as the mold. After the cowl is released, Dennis inspects the surface, looking for imperfections which might require repair, such as air bubbles. The PVA leaves a green color, which must be washed off. He sands off the excess seam flash and then trims the final part. The finished cowling is ready for painting and installation into the model airplane. This fiberglass cowling is identical to the one taken from the kit, except that it is considerably stronger and amazingly light for the strength. The techniques you have seen in this video apply to large molds as well as small. The only significant difference in constructing a bathtub or an airplane wing is in the selection of the reinforcement. There are many different molding techniques. The one we have shown you is a reliable way to approach your first project. Most people will modify and adjust materials and methods until they find their favorite combinations for their application.
The process of molding seems complicated at first, but a little practice is all it takes to be able to make things you have never been able to make before. Remember that we are always willing to help answer your questions and help you select your materials. Good luck on your project, and thanks for watching.